Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. There we go. My name is Andreessen Brown. I'm Chief Financial Officer with the Spencer Foundation in Chicago and a very proud Forum board member. At yesterday's breakfast session, we heard from 3 authors who shared perspectives related to critiques of philanthropy and the need for change in our sector. Today, we'll hear another perspective from author Phil Buchanan. Phil is president of the Center for Effective Philanthropy, a Forum member, widely credited with bringing voices of stakeholders to funders. He was hired in 2001 as CEP's first executive and has led its growth into the learning provider of data and insight on philanthropic effectiveness. Phil is the author of a new book, Giving Done Right, Effective Philanthropy and Making Every Dollar Count, which he describes as his attempt to reclaim the discussion of giving and the nonprofit sector from the business knows best crew. This morning, he'll sit down for an insightful conversation with our good friend and colleague, Janine Lee, President and CEO of the Southeastern Council of Foundations. As many of you know, Janine is a veteran strategist and grant maker in philanthropy with more than 25 years of rich and diverse leadership in nonprofits and foundations. During her career in philanthropy, she has served in leadership roles at the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation, the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation, among others. Janine currently serves on the Independent Sector's Board of Directors and the Forum's Racial Equity Committee, and she stepped down last year from the Forum Board after serving for 6 distinguished years. You can read their full bios on your app, and I now ask that you please join me in welcoming Mr. Buchanan and Janine Lee.
Thank you.
Phil, good morning.
Good morning, Janine.
Good morning, everyone. You know, I know people don't know this, but I've known you, Phil, for over 20 years. And Phil and I first met when I was at the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation many, many years ago, and he was just telling the story this morning about the General Operating Support Grant that Kaufman gave. And it was at the Kaufman Foundation that I had the inspiration to co-found GEO as well. So we've been partners for many, many years. So Phil, so many people know about you, but do they really know you? You know, I mean, I feel like we do this work together and we spend so much time together, but I would really like people to know just a little bit more about you. So, you know, we know that you're a columnist, we know that you're an author, we know you're a speaker, we know that you're the founding CEO of CEP, but I've heard some stories that you've shared about just you growing up, your family, the influence of your father. Would you share some of who you are with the group?
Sure, thanks, and it's great to be here with you, and good morning to everybody. And you know, I feel like philanthropy-serving organizations are maybe like the toughest audience because you all know, you all know so much about effectiveness. And then Janine said to me, and I'm going to make you, talk about something personal at the beginning, and talk about your dad. And I said that's the part I'm most nervous about. But let's get it over with. So, I think we all have people in our lives, right, who have like an outsized influence and impact. And for me, that person definitely was my dad, who was born in Canada and just a regular, middle-class white kid. Dad managed a Hertz rental car franchise, and somewhere along the line, and I don't really understand how it happened, my dad became very focused on activism and on his responsibility to make a positive difference in the world. So I think there's a photo of my dad and me that we can show.
Yeah.
And they'll bring it up in a second. That's us in Oregon, where I grew up hiking, and my dad was. I just admired his convictions. He was arrested in lunch counter sit-in in North Carolina in the early '60s. He, much to my puzzlement at age 10 or 11, told me that he was taking a summer to pick fruit with seasonal farm workers, and he had learned Spanish, and he wanted to understand their lives better. My dad was, all about sort of getting proximate to people in pain and to try to and people who have challenges that he didn't have, and he used to do things like lie across the train tracks that were carrying nuclear warheads up to Washington State. I learned a lot from my dad about like having the courage of your conviction. I think my dad also taught me some cautionary tales about the need to not have the need not to neglect the important personal relationships in your life. And my parents split up when I was young, and I had a good relationship with my dad. I saw him every weekend. And then in 1984, I was 14, and my brothers came home from school, and we went over to his house in the afternoon on Christmas Day, like we always did, and rang the doorbell, and nobody answered. And we went in, and we found that he had died in his sleep, really of some kind of undetected heart arrhythmia. And I think really at that point, at 14, and now I'm 49, I'm older than he was when he died. And I think anybody, I'm sure there are lots of folks in the room who lost a parent young. You spend a lot of your life kind of reckoning with, well, what does his legacy mean for me? And what do I want to take from what he did? And what would he think about what's going on in the world right now? And so that's a little bit about him and how he shaped me. I mean, he was in many ways an ordinary guy, but also kind of extraordinary for some of the things that he did that a lot of people who came from his background didn't think to do. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a really beautiful story, and I know that his influence and even some of his successes and failures had an influence on your thinking about effectiveness. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, I guess I did feel like some of what my dad did was, pure idealism without any practicality, right? And so, I think in my career I've been looking for, opportunities to affect, systems and institutions as opposed to just being sort of a lone warrior, as I think my dad sometimes was. It's hard, I think, and actually there's a lot of diversity in this room in terms of the type of organizations, but a lot of us, I think there's a fair number of us in this room, whose mandate is to work with funders with a lot of different goals, right? Like the funders come and our mandate is to work with them to help them to be more effective. Although there are obviously certain funders we wouldn't work with. But then why do we do this work, right? Why are we here? It's not just to be like technocrats focused on effectiveness. It's because of the pressing challenges that are facing us. And that was true before 2016, and it's especially true now. So I think there's been so much critique of philanthropy, and critique is healthy, and that's good. But boy, in a country at this moment with a racist president who ran as a racist, who's pursuing racist policies, with a administration that denies climate change and pursues policies that deny climate change, with a federal government that is, I think, targeting the most vulnerable, is the only way to put it. Yes, we have to work to affect the outcome of the next election. Yes, we have to work, locally to elect the right people. And nonprofits and philanthropy have the ability and are, in many cases, working to fight against, or to mitigate some of the effects of this administration. And so I think philanthropy and the vast and diverse nonprofit sector it supports has always been a crucial part of the American societal fabric, and we need it now to be its best, especially.
Well, I want to come back to your dad for just a minute and just share with the group. I had the home going for my father just a few weeks ago. But growing up, he used to always say, "You are the stars, the moon, and the light." And I believed him. And so I became very idealistic. I became very idealistic. So when we say in this field that we're about the common good, when we say that we care about the systemic and structural inequities in America, then I feel like we should hold ourselves accountable for that. And so I guess as I listen to you and I feel your passion, how do we reconcile this notion of effectiveness when we are seeing such deep structural inequities in America? How do we reconcile that?
Yeah. Well, that we've got to effectively address them, and so I guess I think one of the challenges is that so much of the conversation that we have about philanthropy, in my view, and this is part of what I try to address in the book, happens in this theoretical kind of space that is divorced and disconnected from the operating nonprofits that are doing work every day on the ground on these issues and that need to be supported more effectively. And so actually, I'll maybe take this opportunity to talk about a couple of people who I profile in the book, and they're people like this all across the country, as you know. But we don't give them, the attention they deserve, and we don't give them often the kind of support that they deserve. So let me just the first one. This is Tiffany Cooper Guy. She's on our board of directors at CEP. I met her when she was the CEO of Bell, which is called Building Educated Leaders for Life. I talk about her story in the book and how she was bused from Dorchester, where she lived with her grandmother, to a affluent white community, and had an experience, in third grade on the playground with racism, and another student's words that sort of crystallized for her that she wanted to spend her life working on inequality, and so that, where you're born did not predict what your educational opportunities were. And she became the CEO of Bell, I think, at age 29. And she was a CEO for 10 years. She's now working at Blue Meridian, the funder consortium. But, she talks about the way in which, she told me a story about going to a business school class on, social enterprise or whatever. And she was talking about her work, and student came up to her afterwards and was like, "Wow, it's amazing. You're such a good leader, and you really even understand the financial statements." And this patronizing, paternalistic view that nonprofit leaders are lesser than, when in fact her job of leading a nonprofit like Bell is way harder than leading an equivalent size business. And on the effectiveness piece, this is an organization that tries to combat summer learning loss, which is the academic backsliding that is particularly all students experience, but is particularly significant for students in under-resourced communities. They've had randomized control trials to see that their program works. The effectiveness piece is really important, because if those students are spending time in an ineffective program, that's worse than nothing.
Yeah.
And they are now expanding dramatically. Now, should we have to rely on philanthropy supporting organizations like Bell to do this work? No, obviously we shouldn't. But here we are, and I'm glad that they're there. This is just some folks at Bell, but and I talk about another organization in the first chapter of the book. This is Greg Cruteau, the guy in the suit, with the young people at UTech, $6 million budget, Lowell, Massachusetts. They also work in Lawrence and Haverhill. They are trying to recruit people out of gang life. And how do they do that? They show up at hospital bedsides. They show up at funerals because that's the moment when people say, maybe I want something different from my life. They visit folks in jail. Then they get them employed at either a mattress recycling facility they run or a woodworking shop that sells cutting boards to Whole Foods, or a cafe that's right across from the courthouse. And you look at Greg Cruteau's job, right? He is a business person, a spiritual advisor, a mediator, a counselor, a policy advocate, all of these things all wrapped up into one. And so when we look at people like Tiffany and Greg, and there are thousands and thousands of nonprofit leaders like this, and we compare that against the rhetoric we hear about nonprofits, or the sort of triumphalist, well, all you need is a little more business thinking, whatever that even means. What is business thinking? Is that like Volkswagen with the emissions tests? Is that the dry cleaner? Is that Google? What is that? We have to support these folks, and we have to fund them in ways that help them to do their work, and we should recognize them societally as the unsung American heroes that I think they are. Yeah.
Would you share with the group the story of Andre, who was served by this program?
Sure, yeah. One of the things that I realized is, so I'll get to that. I just want to say that I realized that at CEP over 18 years, we've done so much work through our research and through our grantee perception report, our applicant perception report, other tools to try to raise up to funders the stories of nonprofits, and then through our Youth Truth Initiative, raise up the stories of the people you're trying to help so folks can learn from them. And in some ways that's worked, and in some ways it hasn't. We haven't seen as much change as I would like to see. And I started just spending more time. Obviously, we all talk to other nonprofit leaders all the time, but actually just like shadowing people, spending time in their organizations. And it's so profound, right, to do that. And so when I spent a lot of time at UTech, and I met Andre, who, not his real name, who had I forget whether he was 17 or 18. I think he was actually 18 in high school. He was spending a lot of time on the streets because of basically his family situation and the amount of sort of fighting that was going on in his house. And he was hanging out with some folks who were involved in crime and offered a sense of belonging, and they asked him to participate in one of them said, let's go rob some white guys. And he went along. Guy was robbed, nobody was hurt, and he knew that he had made a terrible mistake. And he was arrested, and he did time, and he met when the UTech folks came to where he was incarcerated. He met with them. He came out. He struggled and struggled with addiction. He started hanging out with the same folks again. And then one day he called up the street worker who had come to visit him and said, I need help. And they said, show up at 9 a.m. Tomorrow. And he talks about UTech as a place where he felt unconditional love for the first time. He said, he said to me, they mothered me, they fathered me, they brothered me, they cousined me, and he knew that when he fell, UTech folks would be there. They wouldn't turn their back on him. And it wasn't easy, and it wasn't a linear path. But when I met with him, he was 25. He had sort of aged out of the UTech program. He was employed. He had a good job, and a daughter, 2 years old, who was going to the preschool that UTech has started for young people who they serve. And he'd become. And what was interesting about him, and it was also true of a Bell student I spent time with, is that when I asked him what his dream job was, he said to work at UTech. So I really believe, and this is not a research insight, this is just, I believe that giving, ripples outward, that people who receive want to turn around and give. And that in this really, really divisive moment in our country, we need in all kinds of ways to be encouraging giving and elevating it rather than doing all of the things that have happened, including at the federal level, to discourage giving.
That's beautiful, and I know he's a hugger.
Yeah.
He became known as a hugger. Right?
Yeah, right. He hugged everybody. Yeah, it's just an amazing place. And these organizations, like I said before, they're in every community.
That's right. So another thing that I wanted to ask you, Lucy Bernholtz, and we all benefited from hearing her during this annual meeting, and she asked a question. It was kind of a rhetorical question, but I'm going to ask you this question. She said, is the sector deserving of the privilege of its tax-exempt status?
I guess I will say that one of the things that I believe is that we need three distinct sectors that each do different things. Government has one role to play, business and the markets have another role to play, and nonprofits supported by philanthropy have yet another role to play. I do not believe the the boundaries are blurring and that's a wonderful thing and we're all going to dissolve into just one big do-gooding orgy where nobody knows what, I believe that business and nonprofits and philanthropy play different roles.
Yeah.
That's not to say they can't work together or they shouldn't, or work in opposition sometimes, and they need to. Sometimes nonprofits need to call out business and government for their excess. And I also believe each of those sectors is not living up to its full potential, and who among us live up to our full potential every day? So I believe that philanthropy and nonprofits need to be better. I believe, yes, however, that we need to incentivize giving. And right now, we're incentivizing giving for a subset of the wealthiest people who least need an incentive to give. And that makes no sense. And so that needs to change, and I hope it can. But absolutely, I mean, look at the crazy, and I'm not saying this makes it right, but look at the crazy stuff we incentivize in our tax code, like the second home. Absolutely we should support giving, as a crucial part of what has made the good parts about this country good.
It's amazing. Did you say orgy, by the way?
I didn't mean to. Yeah, I apologize. Okay.
I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly.
No, what I mean by that, just to explain, when you go to business school campuses, right? It is crazy to me, and I just had an argument with a Harvard Business School professor about this. The degree to which there is a concerted effort to make it seem as if everybody's goal is positive impact, and we're just have different tax structures, No, actually, publicly traded companies focus on maximizing profit for their shareholders. That is what they do, and we need to be clear-eyed about it. And that does not mean that companies can't do great things. I love Patagonia, but we should not confuse buying a Patagonia with philanthropy or with really working on social justice. So this is what I worry about. There's so much hype, and I think that there's, I don't mean to be too conspiratorial, but I think there are some somewhat nefarious reasons why, it is in some folks' interest to convince you, that Shell is actually, leading on climate change or whatever, and it's so we all see the commercials, and so I think we just have to be sober about this stuff.
So in the CEO forum that we had earlier this week, Kendall was making a comment about that there are no natural predators. And that really intrigued me in philanthropy, that there's no natural predators. So I actually looked that up, and NCRP, and I know that NCRP is represented, had in one of their reports that there's no natural predators beyond the IRS and tax policy. So how does philanthropy move beyond just upward accountability to its donors, to its board?
Right. Well, I mean, as many of you know, and some of you may not, and I don't have all the answers, but a big part of what CEP does is try to bring the perspective of a variety of different stakeholders, including nonprofit grantees, into the foundation boardroom, to foundation leadership. And I've done that for 18 years, and sometimes, you want to have a car idling outside, right? Because funders they're in a bubble of positivity, as you know, because I'm sure that people treated you differently when you were at Kaufman than they do when you're at Southeastern Council on Foundations.
I think I was prettier and smarter.
Right.
And all.
Yeah. And so we at CEP have worked really hard to do that. And I can tell you that, and I think there'll be an article coming out about this, at some point later this year. When we look at folks who have regularly used our grantee perception report, and we actually see, and I can't claim causality here, but we see that their practices change. Not only do grantees tend to have a different and more positive experience, that's not true at every foundation, but it's true in general of funders that repeatedly use the GPR. Those funders are significantly more likely to be providing larger amounts of general operating support, multi-year support. So, I think we have to continually, and PSOs are in a great position to push funders to remind them what they don't know, to encourage them to get this kind of feedback, to encourage them to get proximate. I mean, I'm sure many of you have been in the position that I'm often in, where you talk to a new donor, some person who got fabulously wealthy or for one reason or another ended up with a lot of resources, and now they're like, oh, I'm going to figure out, this whole philanthropy thing, and I'm going to disrupt poverty the way Uber disrupted taxis or whatever, as if it's all so simple. And you ask them, who are you meeting with, And they say, well, I met with this consultant and this donor and that donor and this donor and that donor. And did you hang out with any folks running nonprofits or working as staff at nonprofits? So anyway, I think a big way we deal with this is by just elevating the voice of the folks who are doing the work. But I'm open to other ideas.
So, it looks like we have maybe 3 minutes before we're going to open up to the group. Is that right, Dave? So I just have one or two more questions. Let me see. I think I want to go to dependency, because you talk about that in the book. And just to set some context for this, I worked for several different CEOs when I was at the Kauffman Foundation. And one of them that came in later in my career, because I was there 15 years, really had almost a distaste, if you will, for nonprofits, which probably doesn't surprise a lot of the people in the room. That happens. It's unfortunate, but it does. Didn't believe that they contributed to GDP, did not want to support nonprofits, and basically told me I would be the one that had to turn off the lights on them. But I made sure before I did that I got another $17 million out the door to support them. But one of the things that he said to me that I'll never forget is that I feel that you were a part of creating dependency, the dependency on the Kauffman Foundation by those organizations. What's your thoughts about creating dependency?
I find that just so, like, that story just makes me want to throw this chair. You know, it's so frustrating, and I'm sorry that you had that experience. I mean, it's so frustrating. You know, it makes me want to say something that I haven't had a chance to say, which is like, you know, we haven't even talked on about who's on the boards of foundations, and the lack of voices on those boards to say, no, actually, you know, I lead a community-based nonprofit, and let me help you folks understand what that's like or whatever. That is, and the lack of diversity on foundation boards on so many different dimensions. But the dependency issue is like, it makes no sense to me. I mean, your role as a foundation is to get grant dollars out the door to organizations who are making progress against shared goals. If that's happening, if they're getting results against shared goals, you should be dependable in supporting them for the long haul. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. And so I think, I mean, we could sort of like, you know, talk about where that comes from, and I do think part of it is related to sort of like the investment analogies that get thrown around that aren't helpful. But the best funders recognize that when there's significant overlap between their goals and the nonprofit's goals, then long-term support and a joint, you know, collaborative monitoring of the progress that is being made and continued support if the organization continues to do well is the way to go for however long.
Well, we are going to turn, I think, to the audience and give you an opportunity to engage Phil. And Nick, did I see your hand up? Or yes, Nick?
Hi, Nick Dachikowski with the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. Phil, thank you. Also, Janine, Phil, you know, your thinking is very valuable for the sector, and I appreciate what you're offering. Last conference I was hearing you at, you made the distinction between giving and investment, which I thought was very refreshing. But I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on that. For one, giving, to me, encompasses both what is sometimes drawn as a distinction between philanthropy and charity, with charity often meaning, well, the stuff that you're giving the man the fish, and philanthropy being the teaching the fish and all that stuff. I wonder if, you know, and so charity would imply an approach that isn't necessarily investment, because to me, in philanthropy, the idea of it being investment is very helpful in that there's a return expected, obviously not in profit, but in whatever change you're trying to make for whoever is being helped or being engaged. But sometimes I think it's problematic. I work with some organizations that work in other countries in particular, and they make they are almost dismissive of, you know, the charity thing, or they'll call it assistentialism, and it's not development, and so it's, you know, not as important. But yet that's part of giving as well. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on.
Yeah, I mean, I have too many thoughts on it, and I think it's a great question. I mean, I think there's a lot in what you said, Nick, and also I want to say I understand that I missed maybe a highlight of the conference, which was your performance yesterday. But look, investing implies it doesn't just apply. It is about ownership, right? And I don't think that's the right analog. And it's, transactional in a certain way. I tell the story in the book of being in a business school class in 2000, and a self-styled, venture philanthropy maven came in and told us that they were, going to bring investing discipline to the dysfunctional nonprofit sector that didn't have, effective leaders. And I think that's been a lot of the way that the analogy gets used, not always. And when you talk to really, really thoughtful folks like Mario Marino, who's home is Cleveland, who I met with yesterday, and he was very kind and letting me, quote him in the book, saying that he thought, he founded Venture Philanthropy Partners. He thought venture philanthropy was a great analogy for giving. And I said, a couple decades later, what do you think now? And he said, it isn't. It isn't. And he says, I was arrogant, and I didn't recognize how much more complicated and difficult this work is. So I think you can be very results-oriented, interested in what is being achieved without adopting this sort of framework that makes sense in another sector, but not in this sector. The two don't have to be married in the way that they often are. And then I think there's a whole other set of issues about that you're sort of alluding to about where you choose to intervene, and as a giver or as a nonprofit. A lot of givers will intervene in multiple places along the spectrum between sort of salving, if that's how you say that word, pressing immediate pain and solving, sort of upstream issues, root causes. And I think that it gets described as if a focus on root causes is sort of morally superior. But it's really important. When we can end something and eradicate a disease or end a chronic problem like homelessness in a particular community, obviously that should be the goal, and that should be what we try to do. And at the same time, we need to recognize that there is suffering every day, and that philanthropy that strategically and effectively reduces that suffering is important too. We shouldn't, we should focus on early childhood education, absolutely. And we also should not, as a society, turn our back on the young people that UTEC serves.
Would you be sure and introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm John Guest from the city of Cleveland, Ohio, here with Philanthropy Ohio. Welcome home to Cleveland, Nick. Thank you for last night as well. Two things. One, I want to thank you for this format. I like this for a breakfast situation, a little bit more casual. Scripted remarks before 9 a.m. You never hear a scripted speaker talk about orgies. So building off yesterday's panel, it makes so much sense. I don't know what's happening in the next few days, but maybe I'll come back. You mentioned the grantee perception report, and I know some folks here in Cleveland, like the Gun Foundation, have participated. Can you give one or two examples on either side? One, potentially where grant makers have run away from or denied the information that you provided them, or more importantly, an example of how a foundation has really utilized that information to transform the experience that applicants have with their organization or the impact on community.
Sure. There's so many different examples of funders that have made meaningful change. For instance, I describe the Hilton Foundation in the book and their evolution from an organization that really didn't have much goal clarity at all. That was very frustrating to grantees on a number of different dimensions. And they obviously gave me permission to tell this story. And then they really were able to clarify what it is they were trying to do, but they didn't do it in a top-down, here's our strategy, serve it up kind of way, but actually in a highly sort of iterative way with grantees in various programmatic areas, to the point that 10 years later, if they had gone from the bottom of the comparative set in terms of the grantee experience to the top of the comparative set. We had a recent experience with a funder where we informed them, and this was very difficult for them to hear, that their grantees, the survey respondents who identified as people of color, were having a less positive experience along a number of different dimensions than those who identified as white. And they, to their credit, I think the staff is working very hard to change. I go on and on about, there's so many, and we have some case studies that we've written up about funders that have made significant change. And of course, it is also true that I've been in the position of working with funders that have repeatedly used the grantee perception report and been unwilling to really do the hard work that is required to make change, and then they wonder why, things haven't gotten better, and I can tell you why, and I think the biggest problem is this perception, and I think it's particularly true at larger foundations, that, people really do say this to me, that we're not interested in our grantees having a positive experience because we're focused on impact. We have to hold their feet to the fire, and their unhappiness is the inevitable collateral damage of our focus on impact. And the level of not just paternalism, but condescension in that line of thinking, as if the nonprofits are not equally focused on impact, right? I mean, this is such a trap that funders fall into, to think they're the only ones who care about, why are people doing this work, right? Because they want to make an impact, whereas, you contrast that with a foundation that's kind of become our poster child, so I should probably stop referencing them so much, but Wilberforce in the Pacific Northwest, that does such an outstanding job of focusing on results in their work to protect habitats for wildlife and to protect the Pacific Northwest, with a partnership, with nonprofits that puts the nonprofits at the center, helps them to learn from each other, provides them all kinds of ways to get stronger as organizations.
Well, when I was first starting my career in philanthropy, my mentor, Gene Wilson, who had served as the president of the ARCO Foundation in California and moved to Kaufman, he said there's an inextricable link between philanthropy and public charities. And I think we have to remember that.
Right.
So, other questions?
As we wait for a question, I would just say that, that's particularly important in this moment of critique. I mean, I think we're all familiar with, for example, Rob Reisch's book, Just Giving, and Anand Giridharadas' book, Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World, which I think are both really, really valuable contributions to the discussion and debate about philanthropy. And Anand does a great job of, I think, taking on what he calls market world, in ways that I really agree with, and as you can tell from the way I've described my perspective. But I think one of the shortcomings of those critiques is that there is, I believe, literally no discussion of actual nonprofit organizations in those. So to the extent, so who is ultimately affected, by, and here we are in this moment in which giving. We now see that giving, did not increase in real dollars. It decreased 18 over 17. There's lots of evidence of decrease in the percentage of households giving. And so we should absolutely critique what needs to be critiqued and have healthy debate, and there's probably been too little critique. And at the same time, we need to try to remember who is affected ultimately by choices about giving, and it is this vast and diverse array of nonprofits. many of which are doing extraordinary work.
Well, these are limited and very precious resources. And if it's not the foundations that are deploying those limited, precious resources, it seems to be that the alternative that in both cases I think they're suggesting is essentially government.
Right.
And I mean, that's ideally,
Right.
maybe in someone's mind, might be the best alternative, but it doesn't seem to be a good alternative right now.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. It does seem kind of disconnected
Right.
From the current moment that we're
Exactly.
in. Yeah.
Exactly. Did we have someone else?
Sure, over here. Edward Jones with ABFI. I'm appreciating this conversation, but I'm also struck by last night seeing Congressman John Lewis make the statement that he had to make before Congress. And I'm sure in his lifetime he never expected that he'd have to make such a statement.
Right.
But it's reminding me of what you said earlier around the idea of philanthropy moving and it not moving at the speed that you thought it made as much progress as you thought it would have made. And so I'm thinking the same about the country. But if coming back to philanthropy and its role in advancing work, getting effective strategies, learning all the lessons that it's been taught over the years, what do you think are the impediments to progress at the speed that it should be moving?
The impediments, I mean, I do believe that one of them is, and it depends what segment of philanthropy we're talking about. But if we're talking about the let's say the largest 100 foundations in the country, let's just single them out. I think an impediment to progress, and this may be like a unwise thing for me to say publicly in terms of CEP's relationship with those foundations, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is who's on those boards. And I think that the lack of, I think we cannot have an expectation that foundations will operate with a sense of urgency if we don't have people in the boardroom who are on the ground where things are most urgent. And so the percentage, the number of foundation boards today that are literally all white, or that lack, and I'm not saying there shouldn't be business people on foundation boards, but there shouldn't be only business people on foundation boards. And why are there not more nonprofit leaders in those boardrooms? So I think that is a major impediment in my view. And then I think we've alluded to this already. I mean, I think Janine brought up the point about there aren't natural predators, and so what I remember somebody asking me one time in some meeting or event, what will compel folks to act with urgency and to really focus on the effectiveness in pursuit of these crucial goals, and ultimately it does come down to leadership and the moral imperative to do it. And I don't know how, I think there are things we can do. We can highlight, the folks like whoever it is, the Libra Foundation, the one in the Bay Area that is, trying to work to support nonprofits, at the border, dealing with issues like family separation. We can highlight them and hold them up. We can highlight the other funders that have stepped up in various ways. But if I knew that, I mean, your question is a right one, it's a good one, and if I knew, all the answers, I would certainly tell you them. But those are the ones that come to mind, and I'm frankly curious what others think and what you think.
Sammy Moon.
Hi, I'm Sammy Moon from Jackson, Mississippi. I'm with the Mississippi Alliance of Nonprofits and Philanthropy. And I say that slowly because it's a new creation as of mid-March of this year that came from a 2-year planning process where we, in effect, have done away with the Grant Makers Association in the state. We've done away with the Center for Nonprofits Association in the state, merged the two together, into the single organization that is now the Alliance. Not an easy process to go through at all, but as I was talking with somebody yesterday, we were talking about, well, there still needs to be safe space for philanthropy to speak and for nonprofits to speak, and that's true. We recognize that, but where we are at this point is that becomes the exception rather than the rule. And we see affinity groups as being the place where a lot of learning, sharing, growing, developing, joint work, evaluation strategies between philanthropy and nonprofits happen. So we're really ratcheting up our affinity group. So all of that to say, we probably are taking quite the risk here, but we're all in on it, from governance to management to everything about it. So my question then with that is just your reaction. Are we on the path where you think the field is headed, or are we out there about to go off the cliff?
Well, I'm so interested in what you're doing, and I would love to stay in touch and hear how it goes. And I guess here's how I feel about it, and I, that we need absolutely to help sort of break down the sort of boundaries between funders and nonprofits, and we've been basically talking about that, and get folks understanding each other better. Absolutely. I mean, full disclosure, just because I would feel like a hypocrite if I didn't say that, CEP's way of trying to have influence has been, when we have a conference every other year, it is funders. There are nonprofit speakers there, but the primary audience is funders, and the theory there has been in part that that the power dynamic is so great that it that is very difficult for nonprofits to give direct feedback. And part of what we've tried to do through our research is sort of be the ones to stand up there and say, like, hey, you're failing nonprofits in this way or that way, whether at the field level in our research or whether at the individual foundation level through our assessments. And so that's been our kind of strategy, but I think that there's room for a lot of different strategies and a lot of different ways to have influence, and that in general, I think the notion that like funders need to be protected from nonprofits asking them for grants is, laughable, right? I mean, because that is their job, to be asked for grants and to decide whether to make them or not. So we got some critique, which was interesting, because most conferences are set up like this in philanthropy, which doesn't make it right at all. But it was interesting to me, like folks sort of critiqued us for this just recently, and it did make me wonder whether we should think about some different approaches. So I love what you're doing. I think like we need to try different things, and I'd love to see and hear how it plays out over time. So thank you for your question and sharing what you're doing.
Yeah. Any other? Yeah. Jeff? Oh, okay, we got.
There we go. Yeah. Just one follow-up. You actually touched on it. Oh, and Dreesen again. Hello, everyone. There are lots of opportunities that we take advantage of in the space to raise up good examples of foundations that are doing good things, and really, I think, effectively connecting with nonprofits. There are many, many examples of those that are not.
Right.
How do we create a culture in this field where we are able to express that and call out those that are not being as effective as those great examples that we see?
Yeah. I think just by all of us trying to do it, and I think, and then there's always these questions about what is the right way to call someone out, and I'll give you an example just because a very recent thing that comes to mind. I'm thinking, no, maybe not. But I guess a question that I'll try to, because I think that would be too identifying, because sometimes the right way to get someone to be open to change is to really privately say to them, I just had this experience with a funder where I said, you cannot do this anymore, and it's funny. Okay, I can tell the story in this way. I was leaving the house. I was talking to my wife, and I was trying to get advice about how do I deal with this, because I feel almost complicit if I don't say something. But if I come in and say it right off the bat, I don't know, and I waited for an opening and it came, and it doesn't always come, but it came like 35 minutes into the conversation, and I was able to say it. And I think we have to, so it's like figuring that out. Like, when is the moment that you say it privately? When is the moment that it's so, someone needs to be called to the carpet publicly? These are really difficult, decisions that have to do with how you think people change. But you all, with members who are foundations or donors, you have a unique ability to do that, right? And to take people aside and say, hey, like, that's not how we should roll here, or whatever the conversation is. And we have to show courage. And I also think that, we need to encourage nonprofits. I sometimes think nonprofits silence themselves in ways that it's easy for me to say, but I think sometimes they silence themselves and they sort of head down, okay, and they don't say, like, this is not working, or they don't just go full like Megan Rapinoe when they accomplish something and just, like, and I think that we need to encourage that too, just the directness. We did this, and if you want us to do more, you're going to have to fund us differently. And I think sometimes grantees think if they say that very directly, it's going to be the end of the relationship, and probably sometimes they're right. But often it's not true. Often funders will respond. So I think we all have to be maybe a little bit more courageous in calling things out, but we also have to be smart about how we do it and our assessment of whether this person can change, and then how will they hear it, and all of that kind of psyching out the situation stuff that you got to do to be effective.
Well, and I think, too, that staff and former staff of many of these foundations where there are essentially bad actors, they're just fed up.
Right.
And they're starting to speak out.
Right.
And so one way or another, it's time to change some of that behavior. Jeff.
Phil, thanks so much, and Janine. Jeff Poulos, former board chair of the United Philanthropy Forum. So you've got 300 philanthropy-serving organization staff people here, minus the 30 people that were at the bar too late last night or so. And wondering what you would tell, what one or two things you would challenge us to do in the roles that we're in, and you're also in this role too, so you're doing it yourself. But how would you challenge us to go forward now?
Yeah, one thing I've thought a lot about is, we're not a membership organization at CEP, although people usually think that we are. But I've spent a lot of time hanging out with folks who lead membership organizations, and I guess one of the traps that I think people fall into, it's actually the same thing community foundations do too, is to think we have to be sort of all things to all people, and we can't stand for anything, because then we might lose members and we might alienate folks. And I guess I don't believe that. I believe that people want to be a part of an organization that stands for something. And so while you might lose some, you'll gain more if what you stand for really makes sense and resonates, and you can make it work. And I think, Janine, you're an example of a leader who is very clear about your values and what you stand for, and you have, as was discussed at yesterday's lunch plenary, a very diverse, set of members, and you've managed to be very successful. And so I think, I think a little bit more throwing caution to the wind on and taking advantage of your ability. I guess it relates to the last question to a certain extent. So I think that would be, I think people are too careful and too cautious and too worried about, well, can we really have this speaker speak at the conference or whatever? Yes, you can, do it. And so I think that would be one thing that comes to mind.
So, ladies and gentlemen,
Can I
was so caught up in this great conversation that I'm noticing that we're at 0. So how are we doing, Dave? Do we have time for one more question?
I've been trying to ask a question.
I
for a while.
apologize.
That's okay. You can't see me from this side.
Please do.
Okay. So my name is Maria Vizcarrando. I'm a newly selected president of the Council of New Jersey Grant Makers. And I wanted to get up because I'm listening to you, and I'm kind of a strange bird in this whole mix. My whole career over the last 30 years has been leading nonprofit agencies. So I'm not coming in as a historical funder, but the person on the other side. Mm-hmm. My funding experience was as a United Way executive, which is probably the closest thing to a funder grantee experience. And so I'm listening to you, and I'm trying to think of opportunities that would help us move more into that partnership that you're talking about between funders and grantees. And I think all of us, and I know some other people are doing this as well because I have looked at some of the best practices, but I would think that at least the first step is developing a really good relationship with the organization in your state that works with the Center for Nonprofits, whatever it is, whether it's the Institute of Nonprofits, Center of Nonprofits. In New Jersey, we are basically tied to the hip with our sister organization.
Right.
And that's how we're starting to get very involved in civic engagement. When we have a major conference, they always play a part in that role as well. And I would love to see more writing about that because I really enjoyed your book, but I think if you could do an addendum to it and to write about those experiences, it would have been wonderful. Just saying.
That's great, and you should blog about it on our blog. So you gave me a writing assignment, but I'll give it back to you. I mean, I think that's great, and I think tying those last two comments together, I do actually want to say one other thing about. So that's great. That's another thing, to Jeff's question that philanthropy-serving organizations can do. Another thing that I know you all do, and I guess, just to make it really more specific, that I think you can do more assertively, is articulate what better practice is, right? And so obviously, I would hope that would include encouraging your funders to get comparative and confidential feedback. I mean, yes, that's what CEP does, but I would encourage you to do that because I think it's so important. But I'd also encourage other things, like to your point, Janine, about staff fed up with, cultures that are toxic or whatever. Like, every leader of a significant foundation, and for that matter, a significant nonprofit, should have a 360 review process in which any staff member can safely give feedback that goes straight to the board at the same time that the CEO gets a courtesy copy. That's what I have every year, and I don't understand why that doesn't happen. Why boards don't take responsibility for ensuring that those kinds of feedback loops are in place. And those are easy. You can create it, and just hire a consultant to just take the feedback and play it back. So there's a whole bunch that we could come up with a long list. I think you can, I think some associations are very clear about that, and there's some good examples out there, and then some probably could be somewhat more out there on, no, this is better practice, and if you remember, we encourage you to do it, we require you to do it, whatever the right way to state that is.
And so as we close, I have one final question for you, Phil, and that is, many years ago, before Dr. John W. Gardner passed, about a year prior to that, I had the opportunity to interview him and ask him a few questions as well at his Stanford office. And he had been a key advisor for Mr. Kaufman, so I had the opportunity to spend time with him over the years. And the question that I asked him as we were closing was, what do you think about the future of the nonprofit sector and philanthropy? And this was his answer. It will be a vital one, but the world is changing, and we must change with it, or we're going to find ourselves in the dustpan of history. So what's your answer?
Well, I think I'm not so foolish as to try to outdo John Gardner. And I would say, yeah, right, I agree. I'd underline that big time. And it's so crucial right now. And so, and just in case this is my last moment to say anything, I want to say just to you, Janine, I think it was actually 18 years ago that we first met. And I think
To be precise.
yeah, and one of the things that I just wanted to thank you for, among all of your contributions to making philanthropy stronger and to the sector, is that, you know, for whatever reason, and these things really matter, you know, you saw promise in what CEP was doing when a lot of people didn't, and you encouraged me, and you actually helped me get a platform at a GEO conference that, you know, and your willingness to sort of take seriously someone who didn't really know anything at that point and provide encouragement made a huge difference to me. And so I just so value your colleagueship and support.
Thank you for that,
and I'm grateful.
Bill. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you. Ladies and gentlemen, Giving Done Right, if you have not read it, it's a must read. And do we have this for folks out there? Yeah, Maggie's saying we've got it. And so thank you so much. It's been a fabulous session. You're amazing.
You're amazing.
Please join me in giving him a hand.
Thank you.